Good afternoon and welcome. I am Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and we'll get started here in a few moments with today's conversation on Nagorno-Karabakh with journalist Simon Ostrovsky and Pulitzer Center Executive Director John Sawyer. As we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. We really appreciate to know where everyone's viewing today from. For those who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C., supporting more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. On our website, please take a look under our reporting issues page where we bring together this work by themes, from racial justice, indigenous communities, environment, climate, public health, and more themes. We have developed a strong university program connecting journalists with college campuses in person and now virtually to engage students. And we award reporting fellowships each year to students from our university partners, now more than 35. On the K through 12 side, we reach thousands of students and educators via class visits, online sessions, and professional development workshops. And we organize public events and webinars such as this one. I'm so happy to see we have folks listening in from Bosnia, Herzegovina, Lithuania, San Francisco, Montclair, New Jersey, Chicago, from the UN in New York. So thank you all for being with us. A few logistics before we move on. We'll start with the conversation with Simon and John, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. You can see a Q&A icon on your screen, so please begin adding your questions at any time during their remarks. Please go ahead as soon as something comes to mind. The chat icon we'll primarily use for any specific technology issues you might have. All attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, please let us know via the chat. We also wanted to let you know that we'll be recording this session to post online for others who could not join us. And a final note, please remember to stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Simon Ostrovsky is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist. He is a special correspondent for PBS NewsHour, which along with NewsHour Weekend sent him to Karabakh with support from the Pulitzer Center. As a special correspondent for the NewsHour, Simon has also hosted a series of reports on America during the coronavirus pandemic and on the crisis in Belarus. He has covered the countries of the former Soviet Union extensively throughout his career, where he witnessed 4 revolutions and 2 wars, as well as having done reporting from the Middle East, where he has covered the Iraq War, Syria, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Simon covered the 2014 Crimea crisis and the war in eastern Ukraine for Vice News, for which he was awarded the prestigious DuPont Award from Columbia University and was nominated for 2 Emmys. He also won a 2013 Emmy as a producer of Vice on HBO. John Sawyer is the executive director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which he founded after a 31-year career with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, including more than 10 years as that paper's Washington bureau chief. John's projects for the Pulitzer Center in particular have included reporting from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, India, Bangladesh, China, Haiti, and the Caucasus. His work has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, Al Jazeera English, Neiman Reports, and PBS NewsHour. He was the executive producer of Live, Hope, Love, the center's Emmy Award-winning website on HIV in Jamaica. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Simon.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Ann and John, for having me speak with you guys today. And I'm always very grateful for the support that I get from the Pulitzer Center to support my reporting from all around the world. This year, especially when people were so focused on covering, understandably, the US election and the coronavirus pandemic, it's important to remember that the rest of the world continues to chug along. And we've got the Pulitzer Center to help us get information out about it, especially when a lot of the net want to give viewers, what the viewers want. But we also have to remember that sometimes as journalists, it's our role to let the viewers know what's going on, whether they like it or not. And luckily we have the Pulitzer Center to help us do that and help me go to some of these places. We're talking about Karabakh today, which is a ethnic Armenian enclave within the internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan. But earlier this year, the Pulitzer Center actually helped me travel to Belarus, where protests erupted after a contested election in August there. So I've been to the Soviet space a couple of times this year, traveling on some very empty and eerie flights to get there and witnessing some very eerie and scary events when I got there. I have been interested in the Caucasus region since I started out as a journalist in Russia. I worked for a newspaper called the Moscow Times, and I started covering the war in Chechnya for them. That was my first foray into the Caucasus, and eventually I ended up living in the South Caucasus, which is where this war took place, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Georgia is another country of the South Caucasus, in which I covered for 3 years, from the year 2004 until the year 2007. And the Karabakh conflict was the first so-called frozen conflict that I became steeped in after covering Chechnya. That when you spend time in the region really looms large, and it's hard to overstate how much it's impacted the people of both Azerbaijan and Armenia, even though it's very little known outside of the region, especially since it's been, frozen since 1994 until September 27th this year. Again, which rarely got international media coverage, so weren't really on the radar of the international community and the people's viewership habits. But I remember in my time spent in Azerbaijan, how huge of an issue it was for them, because just to give you a little bit of context about what happened in the first war, before we talk about some of my reporting that I did this year. The war started in 1988, even before the Soviet Union broke apart, with ethnic Armenians of the Karabakh enclave asking to be joined within the framework of the Soviet Union to the Republic of Armenia. That desire of theirs was rebuffed and actually sparked anti-Armenian pogroms in other Azerbaijani areas, in Baku and in Sumgait in particular. And the war really broke out in 1992 as a full-scale war between nascent nation states that had just got independence from the Soviet Union. It ended with 30,000 people dead, roughly, and about 1 million people displaced from both sides. There was a population exchange that was kind of reminiscent of what happened in India. You had hundreds of thousands of Armenians who lived in cities all around Azerbaijan, packed their bags or other countries. And you had about 750,000 Azerbaijani people depart areas that were taken over by ethnic Armenian forces in close proximity to Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenia won that, and Armenians won that first war. Not only did they take over Nagorno-Karabakh, their enclave, but districts of Azerbaijan around Nagorno-Karabakh, which had been predominantly populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis. Those Azerbaijanis who lived in those areas became refugees or internally displaced people in other parts of Azerbaijan. And 19 people have been living outside of their homes for a long time. And so this was really the central grievance that Azerbaijan had against Armenians all this time. There was a start and stop negotiating process. But it never really led anywhere, and it's difficult to put your finger on exactly why peace was never achieved, because there was a pretty clear framework for how it was supposed to look. It was called the Madrid Principles. Basically, Armenians were supposed to give 5 regions surrounding Karabakh back to Azerbaijan, keep 2 areas that connected their enclave to mainland Armenia, and in exchange they would get some kinds of security guarantees community so that they could stay in their enclave. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan would get the 5 regions back, which wasn't everything that it wanted, because there were 7 in total that were occupied besides Karabakh. But at least the refugees were going to be able to return, and this was going to solve a pressing humanitarian issue that had gone on for years and years and years. That never happened. And so what we saw this year, and where I come in, is war broke out at the end of September. And Azerbaijan started making some really incredible territorial gains, the likes of which hadn't been seen since this conflict started. And it really took Armenians and Armenia by surprise. And so part of the reason that that was able to take place was because of the technology that Azerbaijan had access to, that it didn't have access to in the first war, and the money that it was able to spend on modern warfare. And I think another factor, the money, I should say, that it earned over the years from exporting its oil, and the support that it had from Turkey, a country which has a lot of resources and has been fighting in Syria for many years now, and battling an insurgency against its own Kurdish minority in the east. So it's very steeped in the art of war, and also provided a lot of technology to Azerbaijan. And I'd like to show you a little clip from one of the earlier pieces that I shot when I was in Karabakh from the Armenian side. I initially came to Nagorno-Karabakh in October, traveling through Armenia, crossing over the border into areas controlled by ethnic Armenian forces. And I spent two weeks there with my cameraman. This clip you'll see talks about some of the technology that helped Azerbaijan in its fight. I think we should pause it for a second because I'm seeing comments that there's no sound. I'm not hearing sound either.
Kayla, we might run it back from the top if we can get the sound added. One moment we're hearing. And also a classic 2020 problem. Too true.
Well, we can keep chatting about, oh, here we are, we're back. No, still no sound. Sorry about that, folks. Let's talk about what you're seeing on the screen for the moment anyways, until we can get it back up and running. Azerbaijan was assisted by really a motley crew of powers from around the world. For one thing, Russia has been arming both Armenia and Azerbaijan for years with sort of traditional style weapons, but in a very cynical way, because it wants to be seen as a mediator, which it was in this conflict, but at the same time, it's arming both sides to fight in a war against each other. Surprising for people outside of the region, Israel sold lots of weapons to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan has a very good relationship with Israel. That drone that we saw just now on the screen was one that was either manufactured in Israel or is being manufactured in Azerbaijan under license from Israel. And I think the reason for that is that the parties to the conflict are under different types of, I'd say, embargo campaigns from the United States and the European Union, which leaves Azerbaijan very few choices in terms of where it can get high-tech weapons. So that left it with Turkey, which we talked about earlier, as well as Israel. Are we cueing the video again?
Azerbaijan doesn't yet rule the mountains, but in this new war, it rules the sky, with an arsenal of sophisticated weaponry purchased with its oil wealth. It's a war in which you never see your enemy face to face. Ethnic Armenian forces are left to warily scan the sky, searching for the next suicide drone or guided missile.
It's a plane. It's a plane. It's not safe here. The same thing happened yesterday. We were hit with bombs, some kind of Smerch rockets or artillery. I don't really know. I'm a doctor. I don't know these weapons very well. See?
Here in Martikert, a military hospital was destroyed in a strike on Wednesday as staff removed bodies for transportation homewards. 2 medics were injured. This town, like other parts of Karabakh, has remained under fire despite a ceasefire that was brokered by Russia last week. Russia once ruled over both Armenia and Azerbaijan, but lately there's a new power player in the region, Turkey. It's supplied its ally Azerbaijan with an arsenal of killer drones and sent in Syrian mercenaries on Baku's behalf. Ankara's involvement is evoking memories of the 1915 Armenian genocide. Martin Sargian fears the worst.
Genocide for us. They don't want us here.
For almost 3 weeks, Sargian has called this cellar underneath a kindergarten in the town of Martuni his home. He shares it with several other pensioners, one of whom was hit with shrapnel when his guard booth was destroyed by a bomb.
Here on the fringes of Karabakh, unlike in the big cities, the ceasefire never came into effect. The war never ended. The men here are frail and old. They say they hope for peace, but they're also ready for war.
Half an hour ago, there were explosions 100 meters from here. We want peace. We want our sons and grandchildren to come here. To be near me, that's what I want.
Martuni has been transformed into a ghost town. The streets are pockmarked and deserted. The sound of distant artillery fire hangs in the air. Yet Violetta Tamunyan refuses to flee. My son is on the front line, she says. If we stay here, our sons will fight harder, knowing they need to defend us.
I have to say that working under those conditions was incredibly stressful and very scary. From the moment that we got into Stepanakert, which is the self-styled capital of the ethnic Armenian entity that controls Karabakh, we saw and heard and felt the blast waves from the shelling that was coming in from the Azerbaijani side. And, it's very difficult in circumstances like that, to not think about your own safety and not hope that the shelling doesn't stop and that one side doesn't advance, because you're actually scared for your own personal safety. I arrived with Yevgeny, my Ukrainian cameraman, in Stepanakert in October. We checked into a hotel where there were dozens of people in the basement using it as a shelter. We decided that we wanted to roam around the streets of the city while they got our rooms ready and see what the situation looked like, what the scene was like. And immediately walking out onto the main avenue, which was almost completely empty except for one old man, he came up to us and said, "You guys need to cross the street. Come to this side of the street because the shells usually land over where you are right now." And, at that moment, I realized that there was so much that I didn't know about what had been going on there for the previous 5 days and how exposed we were to bomb shelters were, what direction the fire was coming in from. And this was a situation that the people of Stepanakert and of course all around Karabakh had been living with for a week at that point. But the war itself, last 6 weeks, it went on for 44 days. So that's a lot of stress that you're putting the civilian population through. And I should mention that the same thing was happening in Azerbaijan. Armenian forces were also documented to have shelled civilian areas in the cities of Berda, Terter, and Ganja in particular. And there was a lot of destruction. Ganja is a very densely populated city. It's Azerbaijan's second largest city, so it's much bigger than Stepanakert. I think much of the population remained in those cities, making the shelling that was carried out by the Armenian forces to Karabakh had fled. The male population wasn't allowed to leave, and everybody who was below a certain age was meant to stay in order to be potentially conscripted into fighting the war. The pictures that you saw in that clip were from Martuni and Martakert. Those are areas that have remained under ethnic Armenian control. Later in the conflict, after I was already back in the United States, and before I took my next trip to see Karabakh from the Azerbaijani side, Azerbaijan made even more advances into Armenian-controlled territory. They moved in from the south and ended up taking the southern portion of Karabakh, maybe a third of the ethnic Armenian enclave. So when that happened, I asked the Pulitzer Center if they would be willing to take me back, to let me go back to Azerbaijan to see what it looked like in the areas, the newly controlled areas by Azerbaijan. I wanted to see with my own eyes because it's really an indescribable go to an area that you've been to recently and it was controlled by one group, one government, one ethnicity, and to come back there and see it emptied of that group and replaced by somebody else. All the buildings are the same, the streets are the same, the trees are the same, but all the people have switched. And it's not something that you can, really see every day. It's really hard to describe. It's very sad and also very scary when something like that happens. And I can only think of my time in Ukraine during the annexation of Crimea and during the war in Eastern Ukraine, where something not exactly like that, but something comparable happened, when one day you see one flag flying over a building and the next day another flag is hoisted. And I'd like to show you a clip from the second trip I made to the region, this time from the Azerbaijani side. when the active phase of combat had already ended and Azerbaijan was in place in some of these areas that had previously been occupied by ethnic Armenians.
So this is what victory looks like. Walls spray painted with the names of Azerbaijani soldiers and the cities that they hail from in an ethnic Armenian town in Nagorno-Karabakh. The streets are empty of anyone who lived here. They fled as fighting reached this area back in October, their belongings now strewn throughout the streets and the contents of their homes upturned. The only people remaining are Azerbaijani forces, reveling in their hard-won conquest, enjoying the spoils of war. For the Azerbaijani military that's stationed here right now, it's probably difficult to imagine what it feels like to be in this area, because ever since they were children, they were told Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Azerbaijan, but they'd never actually seen it with their own eyes, and now they're here.
Thank you to our president. He gave the order and we attacked. We fought. Unfortunately, people were martyred. With the blood of the martyrs, we reclaimed these lands.
These lands have been contested since just before the breakup of the Soviet Union, when their Armenian residents clamored to join neighboring Armenia. That sparked anti-Armenian pogroms, and then all-out war. When it was all over by 1994, they'd carved out a self-declared republic that encompassed lands far beyond the Karabakh region's Soviet-era borders, which were purged of their Azerbaijani residents. Armenians were also forced to flee areas that remained under Azerbaijan's control. All of that changed in the 6-week war that ended on November 9th, with Armenians on the run from an advancing Azerbaijani army.
Before we go to the next section where we're going to talk about some, I wanted to talk about how the map has been redrawn. It's a difficult conflict to understand without understanding what the map looks like. And if after the first war we had a situation where Armenians were in control of their own enclave and districts of Azerbaijan emptied of their population, now we have a reverse situation where Azerbaijan is back in control of the districts where it's also part of the ethnic Armenian enclave where Armenians used to live. So it's a sort of mirror image of what we had before. When you speak to a lot of Azerbaijanis, the trauma that their people went through after the first war after many years now, when you speak to Armenians, they're talking about the trauma that they're going through right now because their people have had to leave this area of Nagorno-Karabakh where they used to live. And I think the most important thing that I would hope would happen is that both sides could potentially see the other side's story, understand that both sides have gone through a comparable, similar course of events that has caused the similar kind of trauma and anguish, and recognize shared experience, and hopefully take that so that they could use it forward to go through some kind of a reconciliation process that will allow them to live in peace in those areas. Because if reconciliation doesn't have reached with Russian brokering in November, is going to be very temporary if these issues aren't talked about openly and contacts aren't restored. I think it's just a matter of time before war breaks out in Nagorno-Karabakh again. And with that, I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for the remarkable reporting that you've done from both sides of this conflict. Back in 2006, when we started the Pulitzer Center, I went to Nagorno-Karabakh and to Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia. It was one of the very first projects that I did at the Pulitzer Center, and it was kind of the very definition of the sort of underreported issue that we thought important to bring to public attention. And there's a role that the Pulitzer Center can play, and Simon, of course, has done this in a number of places for us, and continues that tradition of trying to focus the public's attention on places that matter. When I went 2006, we were a dozen or so years into what we thought of as one of the frozen conflicts left over from the former Soviet Union. It felt like it had been going on forever when you were in Stepanakert, places like that. I didn't realize then that these were kind of relatively early days, that it would continue on for another 14 years until suddenly this fall, as Simon has shown us, it unfroze. So I thought maybe I'd like to start, Simon, if you could just step back a bit and sort of reflect on, in your view, why, what happened, what triggered, what made possible this sudden shift, either internally or in the region or geopolitically, with all of the players who were involved, that brought about this sudden opportunity and change in the status that had been frozen.
I think that's a really good question, an important question to think about. And I don't know that anyone has the 100% solid answer that we're looking for, but I think several factors played into the conflict igniting. There was a popular revolution in Armenia in 2018. It was an anti-corruption revolution, a pro-democracy revolution. It brought in new leadership in Armenia that was credited with cleaning the country up to some extent and was applauded for that on the one hand. But on the other hand, it brought to power a person, Nikol Pashinyan, who perhaps didn't have the wisdom in international affairs that he needed in order to safeguard Armenia's interests. He did some very provocative things from Azerbaijan's perspective. He traveled publicly to Nagorno-Karabakh, which Armenia didn't even officially recognize, even though it had declared itself that in the 1990s. And he led a crowd there in a chant of Karabakh is Armenia. All this after initially having the process, the peace process that had been going on for decades with Azerbaijan. I think people in Azerbaijan and the leadership in Azerbaijan decided that the peace process was not going to go anywhere, that they were not going to see any of their demands met through that peace process, and that the only way to resolve some of the territorial, refugee, humanitarian issues and issues of pride was to try to take it back by force. And the other factors that played into the conflict starting, I think, were the fact that the rest of the world, also the international community, was so distracted by these twin storms of an incredibly and global coronavirus pandemic, which I think the leaders of Turkey, which encouraged and supported Azerbaijan, and the leaders of Azerbaijan decided that this was probably going to be a good opportunity and their only chance to get away with something like this, to, from their perspective, to restore the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. So, those are my thoughts on the subject, and I think all other factors that played into it. But from a sort of 30,000 feet up in the air point of view, those might be some of the things.
Simon, it certainly seemed that the United States, for one, was thoroughly distracted and wasn't much of a player in what happened here. But are you suggesting that from the point of view of Turkey and Russia, were they also reactive to actions that were initiated by the Azerbaijan, or was there intent on either of them to sort of to insert themselves and take advantage of the situation?
I think a lot of observers have asked themselves is which regional power came out on top at the conclusion of this conflict in Karabakh. One thing I think is important to point out is that Russia, as a result of this most recent breakout of war, has ended up with a military presence in Azerbaijan. And that represents a return for its military to all three South Caucasus republics that it once ruled as part of the Soviet Union. In Georgia, Russia has thousands of occupying troops in the regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Armenia, Russia has a military base with Armenia's blessing. They're allies, and Armenia is part of a mutual defense treaty similar to the NATO treaty. That didn't extend to Karabakh because Karabakh is located in Azerbaijan's territory, which is why Russia said it didn't step in to defend ethnic Armenians in this war. But nonetheless, Russia has troops inside Armenia. So Armenia and Georgia have had Russian troops in one form or another for years now. But it's only since November that Russia sent peacekeepers to Azerbaijani territory. Now it has influence, and I think for Russia, influence is a goal in and of itself. And they want to be a regional power, they want to be a global power. For Turkey, you know, the question is what did Turkey gain out of everything it did? Because it took a much more active role, where Russia played a mediating role between Armenia and Azerbaijan in this last phase. Turkey actually sent sophisticated drone technology. In the beginning of the campaign, it actually sent mercenaries who had promised to pay. And cover, Erdogan was standing in front of his parliament, his people, the world, and saying that he would back Azerbaijan and that Azerbaijan had a right to do what it was doing. So he put a lot on the line. I think what Turkey got really from its people, from his people. Azerbaijan and Turkey are both Turkic countries which speak a very similar language, a mutually intelligible language. You often hear talk about one people, two states. They consider themselves to be brotherly nations. So for Erdogan to help Azerbaijan in a successful war campaign, and he could also show his people that he can bring them victory. I think for Turkey, you know, most of the gain is intangible. It's like that. And for Russia, you know, the gain is hard influence with boots on the ground. And of course, as you said, the United States was AWOL, having been involved in the region for many, many years. And actually having made it possible, in a sense, for Azerbaijan to get as wealthy as it did and purchase all the weaponry that it did, because in the early 2000s, the United States pushed for an energy corridor, Azerbaijan to export its oil wealth to Western markets.
So we're getting a lot of good questions here. There's one from Paul Tsukayasen asking, what can be done for the protection of the two sides' cultural heritage? And did you feel from what you saw in liberated territories that Armenian sites are in danger? And I think this also speaks to some of what you reported in the NewsHour pieces about the war crimes on either side and the importance of recognizing that by both as a way forward.
Yeah, later on in the piece that we saw the second, a church at the top of a hill in Hadrut. where the Armenian gravestones have been vandalized and tipped over, and some of the portraits on them have been smashed. And that's just a very small part of what's been going on in the areas where Armenians live that Azerbaijanis have taken over. Azerbaijanis will, of course, tell you that heritage sites in the areas that were occupied by Armenians for those decades since the 1994 conflict. So that, of course, is very sad and unfortunate. And I think that there needs to be a recognition in Azerbaijan that if it wants to be perceived as a just steward of the region for both ethnicities, as its leadership has claimed that it wants to be, then it needs to hold to account the soldiers who are responsible for not only those kinds of cultural heritage incidents, but for more brutal and sinister incidents like the killing of civilians and the killing of POWs and the mutilation of the bodies of POWs and the mistreatment of POWs, all of which was submitted by Azerbaijani troops themselves on the internet with cell phone footage, and a lot of which, clearly shows the faces of the perpetrators who, it seems, felt that there would be no repercussions for this. I think for there to be reconciliation, there needs to be a recognition, on one hand, among Armenians that these similar type incidents took place when they were on the winning side. But I think it's more important right now for Azerbaijan to hold to account its war criminals because Azerbaijan is in the position of controlling the territory where Armenians are supposed to live. Azerbaijan has said it wants to allow ethnic Armenians to return, but that's only paying lip service to humanitarian law. If you're not actually going to take concrete steps to make the ethnic Armenians feel like it's safe for them to come back to their homes. Until soldiers who were involved in those kinds of actions are actually put through court and gone to prison, I don't think anybody will think that Azerbaijan is serious about those things. And again, I want to restate the fact that the Azerbaijani perspective, from its own interests to do this, because Azerbaijan is going to be ruling these areas. Armenians are on the back foot. They've retreated, they've given up territory. And while their soldiers have also perpetrated Azerbaijani POWs, their soldiers aren't in position to oversee the lives of Azerbaijani civilians.
So there are a couple of questions.
Really,
go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that we have a couple of questions about and from a journalist. And one is Daniel Snyder, who writes that he covered the Karabakh conflict from 90 to 95 for the Christian Science Monitor. So the war brought back many memories for me. I read all the coverage. Yours stood out for me because of your insistence on providing historical context and balance, which is difficult in any war. After this brief period of attention and not much of that, it has again disappeared pretty much from the news, except I should add the PBS NewsHour last night, which we were happy to see that report. Meanwhile, there are reports, Daniel says, of Azeri attacks on the Armenian population and scattered fighting. How effective, in your view, are the Russian peacekeepers? You predict that war will resume, and I agree, Daniel says, but is that already taking place? And how can we get reporters back in there? He says, thanks again for your great work on this forgotten conflict.
I think it depends on your viewpoint, whether the hostilities are winding down. And I don't really have an answer to that. I know that there have been skirmishes around 2 villages that Armenian forces remained in, if you ask Armenians, or that Armenian forces returned to, if you ask Azerbaijanis. I'm not sure what the status of those 2 villages are, because they were outside of the map that the Russian peacekeeping forces drew as remaining under ethnic but on the other hand, the agreement that Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia put there, that the sides could hold to the positions that they ended up in when the agreement was signed. So the Armenian argument about those two villages is that we were here, it didn't make it into the map, but the agreement says that if we were here, we get to keep it, right? So, you know, it's really an the question, I think, is this a one-off, or is this something that we're going to see more of in the months to come? And it's difficult for me to say, being so far away. I don't actually know the answer to that, but you know, has ended, and that we could start moving towards a reconciliation track, because, you know, it's really important to try to safeguard as many civilian lives as possible.
The other question that speaks to the journalism is really about how do you structure, how do you go about putting together a story on something as complicated as this? And Nancy Agabian also praising your work for the awareness of history and context. And she asked, how do you deal with conveying so many complexities in your reporting when you're limited by time on a newscast? And is it the time limitations that cause so many news outlets to rely on the superficial kind of both-sidism and false equivalencies in reporting, not just on this war, but wars like this?
Yeah, I hear allegations against journalists of both-sidisms all the time. And I actually don't think that both-sidism is such a bad thing. False equivalency is a different story. You shouldn't take things which are very different and compare them to each other and say they're the same. That's wrong. But to show the perspective of each side, that's actually what our job is. And so that's why I don't find, you know, each side or more than two sides. But I don't find that my job doing that is actually very difficult, because that's, you know, kind of what I was trained to do, and that's what I've been doing for my entire career. And I think journalists take it on faith that, you know, as part of their culture, that is what they're supposed to do, you know, whether one party doesn't like it or not. And unfortunately, I've seen that, you know, the feelings, the emotions about how the coverage has gone have been very high from, you know, interested parties. And I guess that's to be understood, but sometimes it does get under your skin a little bit when people accuse you of being biased or not fair or even-handed because you don't share their extreme position. So that part of it is a little jarring sometimes. But, you know, when people go around saying, oh, this is just another example of both sides, exactly, yes, it is. Yeah, that's what we're doing.
I just, as an aside, as a bit of a shout out for PBS NewsHour. One thing that, to the question of how do you cover something this complicated, there are huge constraints in terms of time. And sort of when the networks covering this kind of story, you'd be lucky to get 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, if that. And that's a recipe for being extremely superficial. And I often say that people, the public, journalists, we don't appreciate enough in the broadcast world what an amazing resource the NewsHour is, that they're still willing to let someone like Simon have 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes of their nightly show to really show you what's going on. Not only that, but then to have 3, 4, 5 pieces over the course of a week or 2 or 3 that you begin to understand. That's why, you know, the NewsHour has been such an important partner for the Pulitzer Center, the work we've done with Simon in Belarus and Ukraine, and projects on Russia and China and all over the world, because they share our commitment to going in depth on these types of stories. I have a couple of questions that are.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Sort of it's kind of skeptical comments and questions from Crick.
Go ahead.
If I'm pronouncing it right. And one is that the outcome of this war has the hallmarks of a pre-agreement. And Crick also asked, how much of this was agreed behind the scenes between Turkey and Russia ahead of time? Why would Aliyev have started a war that winds up with Russian military presence on, quote, its lands?
Well, it's really difficult for me to speculate about what happened behind the scenes, but I realize the fighting that literally actually observably happened on the ground. I think we'd all like to think that there are people pulling strings in the background that make the big decisions, and we don't have any say in what happens, but that's the other side of the story, is that people went, fought, lost their lives, were injured, were forced from their homes, returned wounded. That fighting took place. And I think it was obviously a combination of negotiation between Putin, the leaders of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, but the fighting on the ground also had to play a major role in how the map took shape in the end.
A question from Stefan Stanchik in Bosnia asking, do you think that Azerbaijan will be able to maintain economically the newly gained territories, considering that the prices of oil are going down? And do you believe, it's got a battery of questions here, do you believe that the safe corridor between mainland Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan will be really established? And if it does, what will that mean for Armenia? And do you think that you personally will be banned from entering Azerbaijan since you visited the, quote, occupied territories? This had officially been the policy of Azerbaijan.
Well, to start from the last question, I visited the occupied territories before I went to Azerbaijan, and so that didn't stop me from entering. I had feared that it would, but I spent several weeks negotiating my access and eventually was able to get into Azerbaijan, and I hope that continues. In terms of Azerbaijan's economic abilities, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think that authoritarian regimes are pretty good at mustering resources for large-scale building projects, and on the face of it, building these sort of showy cities, but whether that will have the kind of economic development that you need for the local people to actually have a good life is a different. Has made a lot of the fact that this is going to benefit Armenians economically, and therefore they will be happy to live alongside Azerbaijanis, sort of skirting the issue of the more difficult reconciliation questions that I talked about earlier. And I think Azerbaijanis are fooling themselves if they think that intercommunal life will be restored to the way it was, simply because Azerbaijanis will have proximity to successful economic areas and open borders. I think that's probably an important part of the equation, but it's not the only thing. And in terms of the corridor that they want to build across Armenian territory between the Nakhchivan, I mean, that would really be something. They've discussed similar highways that would go across from Gaza to the West Bank, and this would be a comparable situation, and it's really hard to imagine how they're going to pull it off, and whether it's going to be an elevated highway that Armenians are going to drive under, or whether it's going to be a tunnel that Armenians are going to drive over, or what that's going to look like. I mean, it's going to be a technological engineering feat if it does actually happen, and really a political feat, I think unlike anything we've ever seen before as well. So, one to watch.
So there's an interesting question from Maxwell Charlton asking about the medium term impacts of this war on Aliyev's regime in Azerbaijan. And Maxwell says, if I recall, Aliyev had previously used the occupation of Nagorno-Karabakh and the high number of refugees as an excuse to block any democratic changes within Azerbaijan. And in the near term, I expect, Maxwell says, he'll be very popular, but will that allow other discontentments to arise?
I think if you look at it in the context of what happened with the Crimea annexation and Russia, then that's a very relevant question, because the Crimea annexation gave Putin a serious popularity bump, which lasted exactly 2 years before his popularity came plummeting down to its lowest levels in his history. That was a result of the sort of buyer's remorse of Crimea, in which Russia became a pariah, an international pariah, and the targeted economic sanctions that came with it, and the worsening economic situation in Russia that was spiraling out of control. I mean, at one point, the ruble lost 50% of its value, and that's people's savings just going out the window. So, you know, it's really going to depend, I think, on how Azerbaijan does internationally and economically after this. This is a different situation because Azerbaijan has taken control of areas that are internationally recognized to be part of Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is not going to face international sanctions in the same way that Russia did after its annexation of Crimea. Business is going to continue as usual. In fact, business might even increase. You know, previous question in the corridor that's going to potentially link Nakhchivan and the rest of Azerbaijan, that would link its ally Turkey. So, you know, I think it's really difficult to say. I think, you know, one of the other things that we didn't talk about when, John, you asked me why this was happening right now, you know, maybe the coronavirus and the bad economic situation in Azerbaijan during the coronavirus pandemic had something to do with it too. You know, just speculating here, but maybe Azerbaijan looked at what was going on in Belarus, where people with nothing to do and nowhere to travel to earn money from abroad, as they usually do, stuck at home under quarantine, rose up against a contested election result and essentially attempted to have a revolution in the streets. Maybe he took notice of that and said, well, I don't want that happening here. Maybe I need a short and victorious war. That might have been one of the factors that played into it. I don't know.
So we're near the end of our time. So maybe I'm going to put together one semi-related questions. One from Nancy Agabian asking what role now for the OSCE Minsk group in the wake of the war. Another from Orkun Tagizada on what does international law mean nowadays for conflict resolution? Are there any implications from what we've seen in this war? And then a question about the Biden administration. Do you have any predictions? And this kind of speaks to the international law question as well. What role? Predictions for how the Biden administration may address the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict as part of its, quote, build back better domestic and foreign policy approach. Is there any space for a US, EU-led peace-building presence in the region, or has their relative inaction during the 6-week war led to Turkey and Russia effectively dominating the space?
I probably lean towards the latter part of that because, you know, America and the EU really were missing in action. And I think which was the framework through which negotiation on Nagorno-Karabakh really showed itself to be an utter failure. You know, I spoke with one of the negotiators, certain Ambassador Kavanaugh, who participated in those negotiations in the late 90s and in the early 2000s when I was doing some of the reporting for one of my print pieces on the subject. And he explained to me that the negotiation process preferred the status quo, a status quo in which Armenia controlled the territories, not because they had Armenia's support, but because the status quo prefers an outcome in which there is not harm to civilians. And of course, any changing of hands of territory, there's a potential for conflict to break out and for civilians to get hurt. But because the countries that were part of the OSCE Minsk group didn't put more pressure on Azerbaijan and Armenia to come to an agreement, we got what we did, which is, of course, the loss of life and injury to civilians that we saw in an open conflict. The Minsk group's reluctance to rock the boat actually played out very well for the people on the ground in the end, anyway.
Okay, well, we are at time, and I had a bunch of questions here I didn't get to because yours were all better. I really appreciate what a great audience this has been, and the wide array of topics that we've gotten to in the course of this hour. We're so thankful to you, Simon Ostrovsky, for the conversation today, for the work that you've done in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Caucasus, and so many other places. The video for this conversation will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days, and so I hope you'll feel free to look that up, share it. I want to also thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Kayla Edwards, our producer for this session. We appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us today, and for those of you who are able, please remember that we are, in fact, a nonprofit journalism organization, and so we depend on your support. Please donate today if you can, and in any case, become a Pulitzer Center champion. We've got a lot of things in store for 2021, several specifically for all of our donor champions, including a conversation with PBS NewsHour journalist Nick Schifrin coming up on January the 7th. There'll be plenty more virtual public events ahead, and the place to find out about those is at pulitzercenter.org. And if you haven't signed up for our weekly newsletter, that's an excellent way to be reminded every week, not only of great reporting like Simon's, but also the events and other activities taking place through the Pulitzer Center. I hope you can stay on for a few moments longer to take a brief survey to help us do this kind of event better after we officially end today's session. And with that, I want to thank you again for being with us, and thank you, Simon.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for all the support Pulitzer Center has given to my reporting, and thanks for featuring my reporting today and taking such a strong in the work. And thank all of you guys for attending. I really appreciate it.
All right, happy holidays, everybody, and thanks again for being with us.